With flesh still raw from the foreman's branding iron, Maggie Sullivan stared into the Apache's unflinching eyes and begged for a swift death rather than return to the men who had marked her as property. The cruel brand on her shoulder burned with each labored breath, but it was the recognition in the stranger's gaze of one human being who understood what it meant to be marked against their will that made her wonder if death wasn't her only escape after all. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Arizona Territory, 1892. The forest whispered secrets between the towering ponderosa pines as Margaret Sullivan staggered through the underbrush, each labored breath burning in her lungs like wildfire. 3 days. 3 days since she'd fled the Timber Creek logging camp, her shoulder still raw and weeping beneath the crude bandage she'd fashioned from her torn petticoat. The sun filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating particles of dust and pollen that danced in the air like spirits watching her desperate flight. Maggie pressed her palm against a rough pine trunk, her fingers digging into the bark as another wave of dizziness threatened to bring her to her knees. The forest floor tilted beneath her worn boots, and the distant sound of rushing water seemed to call to her like a siren's song. Just a little further, she whispered to herself, her Irish accent thickening with exhaustion. Her auburn hair hung in matted tangles around her face, once bright green eyes now dulled by fever and fear. 19 years old and alone in a wilderness that seemed determined to consume her. The brand on her shoulder pulsed with each heartbeat. The letters TC seared into her flesh by Foreman Jenkins when she'd refused his drunken advances that night in the company office. "You're company property now, girl," he'd slurred as he pressed the glowing iron to her skin. Her screams swallowed by the remote forest and the indifference of men who'd learned to look the other way. Maggie's foot caught on an exposed root, sending her tumbling down a gentle slope toward the sound of water. Pain exploded through her body as she came to rest beside a moss-covered stream, the cold water lapping at her fingertips like a merciful touch. "Mother Mary!" she gasped, rolling onto her back to stare up at the patches of sky visible through the pine branches. I can't go any further." The forest had seemed like her salvation when she'd fled, slipping away during the chaos of a midnight brawl between loggers. Now it felt like her tomb, ready to claim her body and erase all evidence that Margaret Sullivan had ever existed. No one would mourn her. Her family back in County Cork believed she was working as a domestic in Boston, saving money to bring them over. The letters she'd sent, filled with fabricated tales of America's abundance, now seemed like cruel jokes. The sound came so softly at first that Maggie thought it was just the wind, the subtle shifting of pine needles underfoot. But then it came again, deliberate and steady. Footsteps. Terror sliced through the fog of her fever. Jenkins had promised to hunt her down. "Stealing company property," he'd shouted as she'd vanished into the trees. Her hand fumbled weakly at her side for a rock, a stick, anything to defend herself. The footsteps stopped. Through the fringe of her eyelashes, Maggie saw a figure standing several yards away, not the hulking form of Jenkins or his men, but someone leaner, watchful. She forced her eyes fully open. He stood motionless, regarding her with an unreadable expression. Copper skin stretched over high cheekbones, obsidian eyes that seemed to contain entire histories. His black hair was pulled back, revealing a face marked by both youth and hardship. He wore a curious mixture of traditional Apache clothing and white man's attire. Buckskin leggings beneath a faded cotton shirt with a leather vest. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd heard the stories in the logging camp, tales designed to frighten newcomers about savage Indians lurking in the wilderness. But she'd also overheard quieter conversations about reservations, about people displaced and traditions shattered. The man took a step closer, his movements cautious like those of a deer approaching a stream. Maggie tried to push herself up, but her strength had finally abandoned her. "Just make it quick," she rasped through parched lips, a single tear cutting a clean path down her dirt-streaked face. "I can't run anymore." The Apache knelt beside her, his gaze moving clinically over her battered form. When his eyes settled on the blood-soaked fabric covering her shoulder, he reached toward it with surprising gentleness. "No!" she protested weakly, but his fingers had already pulled the makeshift bandage aside. His sharp intake of breath was the only indication of his reaction to the brand that marred her skin. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them, a recognition that transcended words and worlds. Samuel White Eagle had not meant to find her. The deer tracks had led him in this direction, promising a meal that would feed his small camp hidden in the shadow of the Mogollon Rim. But instead of a buck, he'd found this broken white woman with fire in her hair and pain etched into every line of her face. He studied the brand on her shoulder with a tightness in his jaw that spoke of memories best left buried. TC. The timber company mark, the same outfit that had been steadily devouring the forest that had sheltered his people for generations. He knew their kind well. Men who saw the earth not as mother, but as commodity, who measured worth in board feet and profit margins. "Water," he said, his English perfect despite years of trying to forget it. He lifted his canteen to her cracked lips, supporting her head with a gentleness that belied his calloused hands. She drank desperately, water spilling down her chin and neck. When he pulled the canteen away, confusion flickered across her fever-bright eyes. "You speak English," she whispered. Samuel's mouth tightened. "Carlisle Indian School. Kill the Indian. Save the man." The words tasted like ash on his tongue. 8 years in that place of whitewashed walls and brutal discipline where they'd cut his hair, beaten his language from his lips, and tried to scrub his heritage from his soul. He'd been 10 when the soldiers came, tearing him from his mother's arms. 10 when they'd stripped him of his name, Talks with Thunder, and christened him Samuel. 10 when he'd first felt the sting of the teacher's ruler across his palm for speaking his native tongue. He pushed the memories away, focusing instead on the woman's wound. The infection was spreading, angry red lines reaching from the brand toward her heart. Without treatment, she would be dead within days. "Why help me?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the stream's gentle murmur. Samuel didn't answer immediately. Why, indeed? Helping a white woman brought nothing but danger. If the company men found her with him, they wouldn't ask questions before shooting. If his own people discovered he'd brought a white woman to their hidden camp, some would see it as a betrayal. His recent return from the white man's world already made some distrustful of him. Yet as he looked at the crude brand on her shoulder, Samuel remembered the scars on his own back, thin white lines from the headmaster's cane when he'd been caught trying to run away. Different marks, same purpose, to claim ownership of another human being's body and spirit. "I know what it is to be marked," he finally said, gathering her into his arms. She was lighter than she should be, all sharp angles and hollow spaces. "And I know these plants. They can heal you if the fever hasn't gone too deep." He carried her through the forest, his steps careful and measured. The hidden camp was a half-day's journey, a collection of temporary structures inhabited by those who had refused the reservation, who clung to freedom even as their territory shrank with each passing season. Maggie drifted in and out of consciousness against his chest, occasionally mumbling words he couldn't understand. Once, she clutched at his shirt with surprising strength, her eyes flying open in terror. "Jenkins will find me," she gasped. "He said I'm his property now." "No man owns you," Samuel replied, the words fierce with conviction born from his own hard-won freedom. "And this forest has ways of hiding those who need protection." As the sun climbed toward its zenith, Samuel paused beside a cluster of plants growing in the dappled shade. Setting Maggie gently against a fallen log, he knelt to harvest the herbs his grandmother had taught him to recognize in those precious years before Carlisle. Yarrow for the infection, wild mint to cool the fever, the sticky resin of pine to draw out impurities. Working methodically, he crushed the herbs between two smooth stones, adding water to create a poultice. The familiar motions brought a sense of connection to his grandmother, who had been the band's healer before soldiers and disease had taken her. "This will hurt," he warned, as he carefully cleaned the brand with water from his canteen. Maggie bit her lip until it bled, but made no sound as he applied the poultice and bound it with strips torn from his spare shirt. When he finished, she looked up at him with eyes that seemed more lucid than before. "Why did you come back?" she asked unexpectedly. "From the school." Samuel's hands stilled. The question cut closer to his heart than she could know. He'd returned after learning of his father's death, hoping to find his mother and sisters. Instead, he'd found his band scattered, some dead, others forced onto the San Carlos reservation. The handful who had escaped, like himself, lived as shadows in their own homeland. "Because even a cage with golden bars is still a cage," he answered finally. "And some songs can only be heard in the places where they were first sung." He gathered her into his arms again, continuing their journey as shadows lengthened across the forest floor. Above them, an eagle circled on thermal currents, its freedom a reminder of all that had been lost, and perhaps of what might still be salvaged. Twilight had settled over the hidden camp when Samuel emerged from the forest with Maggie cradled in his arms. The encampment was nestled in a natural depression beneath a massive outcropping of rock, sheltered from both the elements and prying eyes. 7 dwellings, a mixture of traditional wickiups and canvas tents, formed a semicircle around a central fire pit. Smoke from cooking fires rose in thin tendrils, dissipating among the pine branches overhead. The first to notice them was Nijoni, Samuel's aunt, who stood grinding corn outside her dwelling. Her hands froze mid-motion, eyes widening at the sight of the white woman in her nephew's arms. "Talks with thunder," she said, using his Apache name in a low, warning tone. "What have you brought among us?" Her words drew attention. Faces appeared in doorways, expressions shifting from curiosity to alarm. Children were quickly pulled inside by protective mothers. 2 men approached, one elderly with deep lines etched into his face, the other younger with hard, suspicious eyes. "She was dying by the creek," Samuel explained, his voice steady despite the weight in his arms, "branded and abandoned by the timbermen." The elderly man, Grey Wolf, who had once been his father's closest friend, stepped forward to examine Maggie. "The company's mark," he observed, his weathered fingers hovering above the poultice on her shoulder. "Why bring her here? Her people will come searching." "They branded her like an animal," Samuel replied, the edge in his voice making clear that this detail mattered deeply to him. "She ran from them, not with them." The younger man, Kitua, spat on the ground. "White skin brings white trouble. The soldiers took my brother last moon for being where a white man claimed he shouldn't be. Now you bring one of them into our last safe place?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering crowd. Samuel held his ground, feeling Maggie stir feebly against his chest. Her fever was worsening. The arguments wasted precious time. "I will take responsibility," he stated firmly, "and when she is healed, I will lead her away from here myself." A new voice entered the conversation, soft but commanding. "Bring her to my dwelling." The crowd parted as Morning Star, the band's medicine woman and Grey Wolf's wife, emerged. In her 70s, she carried the authority of one who had guided many between the worlds of the living and the dead. "Grandmother," Samuel began respectfully, using the term of honor rather than relation. "I have eyes to see what is before me." she interrupted, gesturing toward her dwelling. This one stands at the threshold between worlds. We will not push her through the door before her time. Inside Morningstar's wickiup, Samuel gently laid Maggie on a bed of soft hides. In the dancing light of the small fire, her skin appeared almost translucent, blue veins visible beneath the surface like rivers on a map. Morningstar knelt beside her, placing a gnarled hand on Maggie's forehead. The fever speaks through her. Listen. Indeed, Maggie had begun to murmur, her head turning restlessly from side to side. "Da, please don't go down the mine again. The foreman doesn't check the supports proper." Her Irish accent thickened with distress. "Ma'am says we'll starve without your wage, but what good is coin if you're dead beneath the earth?" Samuel sat back on his heels, watching as Morningstar brewed a pungent tea, adding ingredients to the poultice he had made earlier. "She dreams of her father," the old woman observed. "Death follows this one like a shadow." "Death follows us all," Samuel replied quietly, Morningstar's eyes, still sharp despite her years, fixed on him. "You see yourself in her suffering?" It wasn't a question. Samuel didn't answer. Outside, voices rose in heated debate. Kitua's anger carried clearly. "Already lost too much to these invaders, and now we shelter them?" Morningstar sighed. "The young ones forget that hatred is a luxury for those with secure futures." She dipped a cloth in cool water and placed it on Maggie's forehead. "Your people taught you their language, their ways. Now you must decide if you have learned only their cruelty, or if you have found wisdom among their mistakes." As if sensing she was being discussed, Maggie's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, confusion clouded her gaze before panic set in. She tried to rise, only to be gently restrained by Morningstar's hand. "Rest, daughter of a distant shore," the old woman soothed. "The journey ahead is long enough without starting it weakened." Maggie's eyes darted between the two faces above her, lingering on Samuel's. "Why?" she whispered, the question encompassing everything. Why he had saved her, why he had brought her here, why anyone would show kindness to a stranger. Before he could answer, a commotion erupted outside. Samuel rose and pushed aside the dwelling's covering to see Kitua and 3 others, faces set with determination, approaching with purposeful strides. "Time to decide, Talks with Thunder," Kitua called out. "Her kind or ours?" Samuel stepped outside Morningstar's wickiup, positioning himself between the entrance and the approaching men. The camp had gone silent, even the children sensing the gravity of the moment. The setting sun cast long shadows across the clearing, painting everything in shades of amber and blood. "Move aside!" Kitua demanded, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. "The white woman cannot stay. We vote to send her back where she came from. To die." Samuel's voice remained level, though tension coiled through his body like a spring. "Better her than us," one of the other men muttered. "Remember what happened to Black Horse's family when they helped that lost prospector? The army came and—" "I remember," Samuel cut him off. Those deaths had occurred during his time at Carlisle, but the story had reached even there, whispered between Apache boys late at night when the teachers couldn't hear. Grey Wolf had joined the gathering, his ancient face solemn in the fading light. "Talks with Thunder," he said, using Samuel's Apache name deliberately. "Your heart speaks with honor, but Kitua speaks with wisdom born of blood. Each white face that knows our location is a threat to every child here." Samuel nodded respectfully to the elder. "You taught me when I was a boy that our strength lies not in how we treat our friends, but in how we treat those who are not our friends." He gestured toward the wickiup. "This woman has no power. She is alone, hunted, marked like property. Would you have me become like those who did this to her? Like those who took me from my mother's arms?" Kitua stepped closer, his breath visible in the cooling evening air. "You spent too many years among them. Their weakness lives in you now. Something dangerous flickered in Samuel's eyes. I have shown you nothing but respect since my return, brother. Do not mistake compassion for weakness. The school did not break me. From inside the wiki-up came a crash, followed by Morning Star's surprised exclamation. Samuel turned to find Maggie on her feet, swaying dangerously, a clay pot shattered at her feet. Despite her fever, her eyes were clear and focused. "I won't bring trouble to you," she managed, her voice stronger than it had any right to be. "Give me water and direction to the nearest town. I'll tell no one about this place." She clutched the entrance flap for support, knuckles white with effort. The sight of her standing there, pale as death but unbowed, shifted something in the air. Several women exchanged glances. They recognized the determination of one who had survived against impossible odds. Najoni stepped forward, her keen eyes moving from Maggie to Samuel. "My nephew carries the wisdom of two worlds," she said. "Perhaps that is what we need in these times of change." She turned to Keetua. "Would your knife against a sick woman make you strong, or would it make you like those we fight against?" Keetua's jaw clenched. 3 days, he conceded finally. 3 days to heal her, then she goes, with or without her fever broken. He looked directly at Samuel. "And you will take her far from here." As the men dispersed, Maggie's strength finally gave out. She would have collapsed if Samuel hadn't caught her, his arms supporting her slight frame with practiced ease. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered as he carried her back to the sleeping mat. "Nor did you," he replied. Morning Star, who had watched the exchange with knowing eyes, began gathering the scattered pieces of the broken pot. "Brave but foolish, both of you," she commented. "Now drink this before stubbornness becomes your epitaph." She handed Samuel a wooden cup filled with a steaming liquid. As Samuel helped Maggie drink the bitter medicine, he noticed her studying his face. "What is it?" he asked. "You're not what I expected," she admitted softly. "When they told stories in the camp about—" She hesitated. "Indians?" he supplied, his expression neutral. "They made you sound like animals," she said, shame coloring her admission. "But you've shown more humanity than any man at Timber Creek." Her eyes drifted to the doorway. "Why do you risk so much for me?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. At Carlisle, there was a boy, James Yellowbird. He refused to speak English, refused to cut his hair. The teachers beat him daily. Samuel's voice grew distant with memory. "One night, he gave me half his bread when mine was taken as punishment. I asked him why. He said, because they want us to forget who we are. Helping each other is who we are." Morning Star nodded in approval as she worked. Wisdom from the mouths of children. Outside, the camp settled into uneasy routine as night claimed the forest. But miles away, lanterns bobbed through the darkness as Foreman Jenkins led a search party along the creek banks, tracking dogs straining at their leashes, hungry for the scent of the woman who had dared to flee. Dawn broke over the hidden camp, painting the eastern sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold. Maggie's fever had broken sometime in the night, leaving her exhausted but clear-headed for the first time in days. She lay on the sleeping mat, watching dust motes dance in the shaft of sunlight that pierced through a small smoke hole in the wiki-up's ceiling. Morning Star had left earlier, murmuring something about gathering fresh herbs, leaving a small clay cup of water within Maggie's reach. The camp outside was coming alive with morning sounds. Children's laughter, the rhythmic thud of corn being ground, quiet conversations in a language whose cadence was beginning to sound less foreign to her ears. The covering over the entrance rustled, and Samuel ducked inside, carrying a wooden bowl that steamed in the cool morning air. Their eyes met, and something like relief flickered across his face. "You look better," he said, kneeling beside her. "The death shadows have left your eyes." Maggie attempted to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her wounded shoulder. Without comment, Samuel slipped an arm behind her back, supporting her weight until she was upright. "Thank you," she said, accepting the bowl he offered. Inside was a thin porridge dotted with pine nuts and berries. The simple kindness of the meal brought unexpected tears to her eyes. How long had it been since anyone had shown her such basic care? "I don't even know your name," she realized aloud, embarrassed by this fundamental oversight. "Samuel White Eagle," he replied, settling cross-legged beside her. "Though here I am talks with thunder. Which do you prefer?" The question seemed to surprise him. Few had ever bothered to ask. "Names carry power," he said after a moment. "Samuel was given to take power from me. Talks with thunder was given to honor the storm that raged the night I was born." A half smile touched his lips. "My mother said I announced my arrival louder than the thunder itself." Maggie smiled in return, taking a small spoonful of porridge. "I'm Margaret Sullivan, Maggie." The food was simple but nourishing, warming her from within. "My family came from County Cork in Ireland. Dar was a miner, but the shaft collapsed when I was 14. Her voice grew distant with memory. "Mam and my brothers took sick the winter after. By spring I was alone." "And then America," Samuel prompted gently. "The promised land," Maggie said with a bitter edge. "I worked as a maid in Boston, but the lady of the house—" She trailed off, unconsciously touching her cheek, as if feeling a phantom pain. "I heard they needed workers in the Western Territories, that a woman could make her own way." A hollow laugh escaped her. "I was a fool." Samuel shook his head. "Hope is never foolish, only blind trust." Outside, a child's voice called out in Apache, followed by an answering laugh. Maggie tilted her head. "What did they say?" "The boy asked if his mother had seen his special stone. She told him to check his own pocket." Samuel's eyes crinkled with amusement. "He collects rocks, like many children." "I used to collect seashells," Maggie offered, the memory surfacing unexpectedly. "Back in Ireland, I had dozens hidden in a tin box beneath my bed." For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, two people finding unexpected common ground across the vast divide of their different worlds. "How did you end up at the logging camp?" Samuel finally asked, the question gentle but direct. Maggie's expression clouded. "The stagecoach left me in Prescott. My money was nearly gone. A man at the hotel said Timber Creek was hiring women to cook and clean for the loggers." She set the half-finished porridge aside, her appetite suddenly diminished. "It seemed like Providence. Good wages, a place to sleep, meals provided. But not what was promised," Samuel supplied. "The first month was tolerable, hard work, but I'm no stranger to that. Then the foreman Jenkins—" She swallowed hard. "He started watching me, making comments. I tried to avoid him, but in a camp that size—" She gestured helplessly. "3 nights ago, he cornered me in the supply shed. When I fought back, he—" Her hand drifted to her bandaged shoulder. "He branded you," Samuel finished, his voice controlled, but threaded with anger. "Said I needed to remember who owned the camp and everyone in it." Maggie's eyes hardened with remembered fury. "I grabbed a shovel and hit him. Don't know if I killed him or just knocked him out. Didn't stay to find out." Samuel nodded slowly, a new respect evident in his gaze. "Fighting for your freedom. My people understand this well." "Your English is perfect," Maggie observed, changing the subject. "Better than some of the men at the logging camp." A shadow crossed Samuel's face. 8 years at Carlisle taught me many things. Perfect English, how to wear stiff collars and tight shoes, how to pretend my dreams weren't filled with mountains I feared I'd never see again." "Did they—" Maggie hesitated, unsure if she should continue. "Mark me?" Samuel's smile was grim. "Not with iron, with switches and shame." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a forearm crisscrossed with thin white scars. One lash for each Apache word spoken. Maggie's hand moved instinctively toward the scars before she caught herself. "I'm sorry. I escaped when I was 18, he continued. Worked odd jobs, saved money, learned to move between worlds without belonging to either." His gaze turned inward. "When I heard my father had died, I came back, hoping to find my mother and sisters." "And did you?" "My mother died of the white man's sickness. My older sister was taken to another school. My younger sister lives on the reservation with her husband's family." The facts were delivered with a practiced detachment that did little to mask the pain beneath. Beyond the wiki-up, a sudden commotion drew their attention. Samuel rose fluidly, moving to the entrance. Grey Wolf appeared, his face grave. "Hunters returning," he announced. They found boot prints by the eastern creek, white men's tracks following a trail toward our valley. Samuel's posture stiffened. "How many?" "5, maybe 6 men, with dogs." The elder's eyes moved to Maggie, who had struggled to her feet behind Samuel. "They're tracking her, 2 days away, perhaps less." A chill swept through Maggie that had nothing to do with her recovering fever. "Jenkins," she whispered. Samuel turned to her, decision crystallizing in his eyes. "You're not strong enough to travel far, but we can't stay here." He looked back at Grey Wolf. "The cave system in the high rocks." The old man nodded slowly. "A good place to hide, but a dangerous journey for one still healing." "I can make it," Maggie stated firmly, squaring her shoulders despite the pain. "I won't risk bringing them here, not after your people's kindness." Grey Wolf studied her for a long moment before addressing Samuel. "Take what supplies you need, and this." He removed a small leather pouch from around his neck. "Medicine from Morning Star for the girl's shoulder." As the elder departed, Maggie and Samuel's eyes met in shared understanding. The brief respite of morning conversation was over. Now survival once again took precedence over everything else. They left as the sun reached its zenith, slipping away from the camp like shadows. Samuel carried a small pack containing dried meat, a water skin, bandages, and Morning Star's medicines. A rifle, ancient but well-maintained, was slung across his back. Maggie wore a borrowed dress of soft buckskin, her own tattered clothes having been burned to eliminate any scent the tracking dogs might follow. The path to the high caves wound upward through increasingly rugged terrain. What began as a gentle slope soon became a challenging ascent over rocky outcroppings and through dense stands of pine. For someone at full strength, the journey would have been demanding. For Maggie, still weak from fever and injury, each step required fierce concentration. "We can rest," Samuel offered as she stumbled for the third time in as many minutes, her breathing labored. "Not yet," she insisted, using a pine trunk to steady herself. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool mountain air. Distance is safety. Samuel's respect for her grew with each determined step. Many warriors would have complained before she did. By mid-afternoon, they had climbed high enough to look back across the valley. The hidden camp was invisible from this vantage point, concealed by the natural contours of the land and the thick forest canopy. Further east, though, a thin column of smoke rose against the sky. "Jenkins," Maggie said, following Samuel's gaze. "He always did like a big fire, said it kept the mountain lions away." She shook her head. "More likely it was to keep his own fears at bay. He's afraid of the dark, for all his bluster." Samuel considered this revelation. Knowing an enemy's fear is valuable. "He's afraid of many things," Maggie continued as they resumed their climb. "Being disrespected, being forgotten, most of all, being defied." Her voice hardened. "That's why he branded me. I was the first woman in camp who ever said no to him." Samuel helped her over a fallen log, his touch respectful yet supportive. Men who need to mark others to feel powerful are the weakest of all. "Is that why they marked you at the school?" she asked. "To feel powerful?" "They believed they were saving us from ourselves," Samuel replied, his tone neutral. "Captain Pratt, the man who created Carlisle, said his mission was to kill the Indian, save the man. They thought by destroying our language, our beliefs, our very identities, they were offering civilization." "Sounds like a different kind of murder," Maggie observed quietly. Samuel glanced at her, surprised by her insight. "Yes, exactly that." As the afternoon waned, the terrain grew steeper. Maggie's steps slowed, her face pale with exhaustion. When she stumbled again, Samuel caught her before she fell, his arm firm around her waist. "Enough," he said, guiding her to a sheltered ledge overlooking the valley. "We rest here until your strength returns." Too exhausted to argue, Maggie sank down with her back against the sun-warmed rock. Samuel handed her the water skin, watching as she drank deeply. "I'm slowing you down," she said when she'd finished, frustration edging her voice. "You could have reached the caves by now without me. Without you, there would be no need for the journey," he pointed out reasonably. "That's my point exactly," she sighed, closing her eyes. "Your people were safe until I arrived." Samuel settled beside her, scanning the valley below for any sign of pursuit. "Safety is an illusion, Maggie. My people have known this since the first white settlers came. Whether today or tomorrow or next moon, Jenkins and men like him would have found the camp eventually." His gaze moved to the distant smoke. "Men who want land or gold or timber don't stop looking until they find what they seek." The setting sun bathed the landscape in amber light, casting long shadows across the valley floor. In the distance, perhaps 5 miles away, Samuel spotted movement, tiny figures on horseback following the creek where he had found Maggie. "They're persistent," Maggie observed, following his line of sight. "Jenkins wants more than a runaway worker," Samuel said thoughtfully. "His pride is wounded, and from what you've told me, such a man cannot bear that." Maggie nodded slowly. "The other loggers saw him bested by a woman half his size. He'll never let that stand." As daylight faded, they continued their ascent, more slowly now, navigating by moonlight. The caves were less than a mile ahead, but the final approach required traversing a narrow ridge with steep drop-offs on either side. "We'll make it by midnight," Samuel estimated, helping Maggie over a particularly challenging section. She gripped his hand tightly, her palm warm against his. "I'm afraid of heights," she admitted, her voice small as she carefully placed each foot. "Never told anyone that before." Samuel's fingers tightened reassuringly around hers. "We all fear something. Courage is moving forward despite the fear." "What do you fear, Samuel?" she asked, the question hanging between them as personal as an embrace. He was silent for several steps, navigating a treacherous portion of the path before answering. "Forgetting," he said finally. "Forgetting the songs my grandmother taught me, forgetting my mother's face, forgetting who I was meant to be." Maggie considered his words, finding in them an echo of her own unspoken fears, of losing the last threads that connected her to a family now gone, a homeland left behind, a self that existed before survival became her only purpose. Behind them, a dog's howl rose from the valley floor, followed by another, the sound carried clearly in the night air, closer than either of them had expected. "They've found our trail," Samuel said, his voice taut with urgency. "We must move faster." "Then we will," Maggie replied, straightening her shoulders and pressing forward into the darkness, her hand still clasped firmly in his. The caves materialized out of the darkness like a promise finally kept. Black mouths in the pale limestone face of the cliff, they were nearly invisible until Samuel and Maggie stood directly before them. 3 openings of varying sizes punctuated the rock wall, with the largest barely tall enough for a man to enter without stooping. "Here," Samuel whispered, guiding Maggie toward the middle cave, which was narrower but deeper than the others. This one stays dry even in the rain season. Inside, the air was cool and still, smelling of minerals and ancient earth. The cave extended about 30 feet into the mountain before narrowing into a passage too small to navigate. Samuel helped Maggie settle against the wall near the back, where the stone formed a natural seat. "Rest," he instructed, unslinging his pack. "I'll watch." Maggie wanted to argue, but found she couldn't. The climb had drained what little strength her recovery had restored. Her shoulder throbbed beneath its bandage, and every muscle in her body ached with fatigue. Samuel moved silently to the cave entrance, crouching just inside, where he could observe the path they had traveled. The night had deepened, the moon now obscured by gathering clouds. In the valley far below, pinpricks of light from lanterns moved like fireflies, marking the progress of Jenkins and his search party. "How long will they hunt?" Maggie asked softly, her voice barely audible even in the quiet cave. Samuel didn't turn. "Men like Jenkins don't stop until they find what they're looking for, or until something more valuable draws their attention elsewhere." "There's nothing of more value to him than his pride," she replied bitterly. For nearly an hour, they maintained their vigil in silence, watching as the lights in the valley moved steadily closer to the base of the ridge. The dogs' howls came more frequently now, the sound bouncing off the cliff faces and echoing through the night. When Samuel finally moved away from the entrance, his expression was grave. "They're following our trail more quickly than I expected. The rain 3 days ago wasn't enough to wash away all scent." Maggie straightened, alarmed. "Will they find us here?" "Perhaps." He knelt beside her, checking her bandage in the dim light. "But these caves have many secrets. My grandfather's father used them to hide from Mexican soldiers long ago." As he worked, replacing the medicine poultice with fresh herbs from Morningstar's supply, Maggie studied his face, the strong planes of his cheekbones, the steady concentration in his dark eyes, the way he moved with such deliberate grace. He was unlike any man she had ever known. "Why did you really come back from the white man's world?" she asked suddenly. "You could have stayed away, made a life somewhere else. Many did." Samuel's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their work. "I told myself it was to find my family," he said after a pause, "but that wasn't the whole truth." "What was the rest?" He secured the fresh bandage before sitting back on his heels. "I came back because every night for 8 years I dreamed of these mountains, of the smell of pine after rain, of the songs the wind sings through the canyons." His voice softened. The white man's world had many things. Buildings taller than trees, machines that moved without horses, books filled with more knowledge than any one person could learn, but it had no soul. "I understand," Maggie said, surprising herself with the realization that she truly did. "In Boston I had a roof, food, even clean clothes, but I felt hollow, like I was disappearing a little more each day." Samuel nodded, recognition in his eyes. "Exactly that." A sudden silence from the valley drew his attention back to the cave entrance. The dogs had stopped howling. Samuel moved swiftly to look out, his body tense with alertness. "They've picked up our trail on the ridge," he said, his voice tight. "They're starting to climb." Maggie pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the protest of her tired muscles. "We should go deeper into the mountain." Samuel shook his head. "There's no way through, but there is another option." He gestured for her to follow him to the back of the cave, where the passage narrowed. "Here," he said, pointing to what looked like a solid wall of stone. "It's not as it appears." He pressed against the rock at a specific point, and to Maggie's astonishment, a section moved slightly, revealing a crevice just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "A hidden chamber," Samuel explained. "My people have used it for generations. The entrance is difficult to spot, even if you know it exists. Beyond the crevice lay a small, roughly circular room about 15 feet across. The ceiling was low, forcing Samuel to stoop, but Maggie could stand comfortably. A small air shaft in the ceiling admitted the faintest glimmer of moonlight. "We'll be safe here," Samuel said, bringing their few supplies through the narrow opening. "Even if they search the main cave, they won't find this place." No sooner had he spoken than they heard it, the distant bark of a dog, much closer than before, followed by a man's shout. Jenkins' party was on the ridge now, approaching the caves. Samuel quickly repositioned the stone door, leaving it slightly ajar to avoid making noise by closing it completely. In the near total darkness of the hidden chamber, they stood motionless, listening to the sounds of pursuit growing ever nearer. "If they find us," Maggie whispered, barely audible, "let me go to them. Say you found me injured and were only helping. They might believe you had no connection to the camp." Even in the darkness, she felt the weight of his gaze. "You would sacrifice yourself for people you just met." "I would not bring death to those who showed me kindness when no one else would," she replied simply. Before Samuel could respond, voices echoed from the main cave, gruff, impatient, dangerously close. "Check every damn hole in this mountain," a voice commanded. Jenkins, his tone sharp with frustration. "She can't have gotten far on foot, not in her condition." "Boss, we've been tracking all day," another voice protested. "The men are tired, and them Injuns could be anywhere in these hills." "I don't give a damn about any Injuns," Jenkins snapped. "I want the girl. She took something that belongs to me." "Your pride, you mean," a third voice muttered, barely audible. "What was that, Harrison?" "Nothing, boss. Just said we'll find her, that's all." Footsteps approached their hiding place, accompanied by the scratching of a dog's claws on stone. In the hidden chamber, Maggie and Samuel remained perfectly still, barely breathing. Samuel's hand found hers in the darkness, squeezing gently in reassurance. The footsteps stopped just outside the concealed entrance. Maggie could hear the man's breathing, could picture him examining the cave wall, perhaps noticing the slight irregularity where the hidden door met the surrounding stone. "Hey, Jenkins," the man called. "I think I found something here." Maggie's heart hammered so loudly she was certain it would betray their location. Samuel's grip tightened on her hand, and in that moment, she understood that he would not let her sacrifice herself, that whatever came next, they would face it together. "Hey, Jenkins," the man called again, his voice echoing in the cave. "You ever see markings like these?" Heavy footsteps approached. "What markings, Davis?" "Here on the wall. Looks like some kind of Indian drawings." In the hidden chamber, Samuel released a silent breath. They weren't examining the concealed doorway, but the ancient pictographs beside it, drawings his ancestors had carved into the stone centuries ago, depicting hunts and ceremonies long forgotten by the white world. "Damn Indian scribbles," Jenkins muttered. "Worthless. Keep searching." The footsteps moved away, but the dog lingered, snuffling at the base of the wall. Samuel slowly reached for his knife, the movement imperceptible in the darkness. If the animal gave them away, he would have no choice. "Brutus, get over here!" Jenkins shouted. The dog whined once, reluctant to leave the scent it had found, before padding away to rejoin its master. For what seemed like hours, they remained motionless in the dark as Jenkins' men searched the main cave and the adjacent ones, their voices and footsteps occasionally drawing near before receding again. Finally, a whistle sounded from outside. "Found tracks heading north along the ridge," someone called. "Fresh ones. Could be her." "Move out," Jenkins ordered. "If we push hard, we can catch up by dawn." Gradually, the sounds of the search party faded, leaving only the profound silence of the mountain. Still, Samuel and Maggie waited, counting heartbeats in the darkness, until he was certain the men had truly departed. "Animal tracks," Samuel whispered finally. "Deer, probably." I saw a small herd yesterday. He eased the stone door open enough to peer into the main cave. They're gone, for now. The relief that flooded through Maggie was so intense, it left her lightheaded. She sank down against the wall of the hidden chamber, suddenly aware of how close they had come to discovery. If that dog had been better trained, then we would have faced them, Samuel said simply, returning to her side. And we would have survived. His certainty was comforting, even if she didn't fully share it. In the faint moonlight filtering through the air shaft, she could just make out his profile as he settled beside her. "You've fought before," she observed quietly. "When necessary," he acknowledged. At Carlisle, the older boys taught the younger ones to box, in secret, away from the teacher's eyes. They said we would need to defend ourselves in the white man's world. His voice held no bitterness, only a matter-of-fact acceptance. Later, working on ranches and railroads, I learned that some men only respect what they fear. "And Jenkins?" she asked. "Do you think he fears anything besides the dark?" Samuel considered this. "He fears losing control. Men like him always do." He shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing against hers in the confined space. "But fear makes such men dangerous, not weak. We should not underestimate him." Outside, the wind had picked up, moaning through the canyons with a sound like distant voices. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Maggie found herself shivering despite the shelter of the cave. "Here," Samuel said, noticing her discomfort. He removed his leather vest and draped it over her shoulders. The garment was still warm from his body, carrying his scent, pine and smoke and something indefinably wild. "Thank you," she murmured, pulling it closer around her. "But won't you be cold?" "I'm used to these mountains," he replied. After a moment's hesitation, he added, "But we would both be warmer if—" He didn't finish the thought, but Maggie understood. Wordlessly, she shifted closer until their sides were pressed together, sharing warmth in the most basic human way. It was intimate, but not improper, a necessity for survival, nothing more. At least, that's what she told herself, as her heart quickened at his proximity. "We should rest while we can," Samuel suggested. "Jenkins will realize his mistake by morning." "Do you think he'll come back?" "Yes, but perhaps not immediately. He'll be reluctant to admit he followed a false trail." Samuel reached into his pack and pulled out a small bundle of dried meat. "Eat something first. You'll need your strength." They shared the simple meal in companionable silence, each lost in private thoughts. For Maggie, the events of the past days seemed almost unreal. Her desperate escape from the logging camp, the fever that had nearly claimed her life, being rescued by a man from a world so different from her own. And now, here she sat beside him in a mountain cave, trusting him with her life when experience had taught her to trust no one. "Samuel," she said finally, using his American name deliberately, "if we survive this, what happens after?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "My people cannot protect you forever. Jenkins has friends in territorial government, men who would believe his word over yours or mine. I could go further west," she suggested, "California perhaps, or north to Canada." "Always running," he observed softly. "It's what I know," she replied with simple honesty. Samuel turned toward her, and even in the dim light she could feel the intensity of his gaze. "There are other things to know, Maggie Sullivan, better things." Something in his tone made her breath catch, such as standing instead of running, building instead of escaping, finding people who see you for who you truly are, not what they can take from you. His hand found hers in the darkness. "I have watched you these past days. You are stronger than you know." The compliment warmed her more than any fire could have. "I've watched you too," she admitted. "You move between worlds without losing yourself. I don't know how to do that." "It isn't easy," he acknowledged, "but it's possible." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the wind's continued song outside. Exhaustion finally overcame Maggie's racing thoughts, and she found her eyelids growing heavy. "Sleep," Samuel encouraged. "I'll keep watch." She meant to protest, to insist that he needed rest too, but the words never made it past her lips as sleep claimed her. Her head drooped against his shoulder, her breathing growing deep and even. Samuel remained awake, listening to the night sounds, alert for any sign of Jenkins' return. But his thoughts were not entirely on danger. They wandered instead to the woman beside him, to the unexpected courage she had shown, to the way her presence had awakened feelings he had thought long buried beneath years of survival and solitude. In the darkest hour before dawn, a new sound reached his ears, not the return of Jenkins and his men, but something equally concerning. Rain began to fall, softly at first, then with increasing intensity. A spring storm was moving in, and with it came a new danger. Flash floods in these mountains could transform dry creek beds into raging torrents within minutes, cutting off escape routes and trapping the unwary. Their sanctuary could quickly become a prison if they didn't move soon. But with Jenkins still hunting them and Maggie's strength not fully restored, every option carried significant risk. Samuel gazed down at Maggie's sleeping form, reluctant to wake her, but knowing that soon they would need to make yet another life-or-death decision. The rain drummed harder outside, echoing the quickening beat of his heart. Samuel gently shook Maggie awake as water began seeping through the air shaft, forming a small puddle on the stone floor. "We need to move," he said quietly, his tone urgent but controlled. "The storm is worsening." Maggie blinked away sleep, immediately alert to the rhythmic drumming of heavy rain. "Jenkins?" "A more immediate threat," Samuel replied, gathering their meager supplies. "Spring storms in these mountains can turn dry creek beds into rivers within minutes. The lower caves flood easily." The implications became clear as a trickle of water appeared beneath the stone door, inching across the chamber floor. "We're in danger of being trapped," she realized aloud. Samuel nodded grimly. "Or worse." They squeezed back through the narrow opening into the main cave, where the sound of the downpour echoed like distant drums. At the entrance, sheets of rain transformed the world beyond into a grey haze, while small rivulets of water were already streaming down the cave walls. "We can't stay, but we can't go out in that," Maggie said, staring at the deluge. "There's another way," Samuel replied, "a path through the mountain itself. My grandfather showed me when I was a boy." He pointed to the back of the main cave, where the passage narrowed. "It's tight in places, but it leads to a sheltered valley on the western side, away from where Jenkins was heading." Maggie squared her shoulders, pushing aside her fatigue. "Then that's our path." Samuel led the way, moving deeper into the mountain with the confidence of one who had traveled this route before, though it had been many years. The passage grew narrower, forcing them to turn sideways in some places, their backs and chests scraping against cold stone. Water trickled around their feet, growing deeper with each passing minute. "The flood is rising behind us," Samuel observed, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "How much further?" Maggie asked, trying to mask the anxiety in her tone. The walls seemed to press in around her, and memories of her father trapped in a collapsed mine threatened to overwhelm her composure. "Not far," Samuel assured her, somehow sensing her distress. "Just beyond this bend, the passage widens again." True to his word, they soon emerged into a larger cavern where they could stand upright. Samuel paused, listening to the sounds of water rushing through the passages they had just navigated. "We made it in time," he said. "Those tunnels will be impassable now." Maggie leaned against the wall, catching her breath. "And Jenkins? If he returned to the caves, he'll find them flooded. He might assume we were caught in it. Samuel's expression was solemn. Many have died in these mountains during spring floods. The thought brought a conflicting wave of emotions, relief at the possibility their pursuer might abandon his search, coupled with discomfort at the idea of anyone, even Jenkins, meeting such a fate. What kind of man would risk his men's lives just to recapture one woman? She wondered aloud. Samuel checked her bandaged shoulder, which had begun seeping blood again from their exertions. "A man consumed by what he believes he owns," he replied, carefully applying more of Morning Star's medicine. "The mine owners were the same with my father's people. They saw the mountains as property, the minerals as theirs by right, and any who stood in their way as obstacles to be removed." "Like you were an obstacle at Carlisle," Maggie observed softly. "Something to be reformed or removed." Samuel's hands stilled momentarily on her shoulder, the insight striking deep. "Yes," he acknowledged, his voice barely audible over the distant rumble of thunder. "Exactly like that." They continued through the mountain's internal labyrinth, Samuel leading with unerring instinct, despite the years since he had last traversed these passages. The air grew fresher as they progressed, indicating they were nearing an exit. "Tell me more about your grandmother," Maggie requested as they walked, partly to distract herself from the darkness and partly from genuine curiosity. "The one who taught you about the healing plants." A smile touched Samuel's lips, visible in the faint light from his small torch. "She was called Speaks with Plants." Speaks with, the strongest woman I've ever known. When soldiers came to our camp, other women would hide, but she would stand before them without fear, speaking perfect Spanish or English, demanding they respect our boundaries. "She sounds remarkable," Maggie said, imagining this formidable Apache woman facing down armed soldiers. She was. "When I was taken to Carlisle, she told me, they can change your clothes, cut your hair, even take your name. But they cannot take what is inside you unless you give it to them." Samuel's voice softened with memory. "I repeated those words every night for 8 years. And did it help? To keep what was inside?" Samuel was quiet for several steps. "Not entirely. Some things were lost, but enough remained that when I returned I could find my way back to myself." He glanced at her. "What about you? Who taught you to be so stubborn?" The question startled a laugh from Maggie. "My mother, I suppose. She was Irish to her bones, gentle until crossed, then fierce as any warrior. When the landlord came to evict us after Da died, she stood in the doorway with nothing but a kitchen knife, and such a look in her eyes that he backed away and gave us another month." The memory, long buried beneath grief, surfaced with surprising clarity. "She taught me that dignity isn't something others can take from you." "A wise woman," Samuel approved. "She would have liked you," Maggie said without thinking, then flushed at the implication. The passage began to slope upward, and the sound of rain grew louder again. Finally, they reached an opening partially concealed by brush and stunted pine. Beyond it, the rain continued to fall, but less violently than before. The storm was passing. From their elevated position, they could see a small valley below, verdant with early spring growth and dotted with wildflowers that had appeared almost overnight with the rain's blessing. A creek, now swollen with storm water, cut through its center. "Beautiful," Maggie breathed, the sight washing away some of the tension that had gripped her for days. "My people called this Hidden Woman Valley," Samuel explained. "The story says a maiden once fled here to escape an unwanted marriage. The mountain itself opened to shelter her." Maggie smiled at the parallel. "And now, it shelters us." They descended carefully, the ground slick with mud and wet pine needles. At the valley floor, Samuel guided them to a small overhang where the ground remained dry. They would rest there briefly before continuing westward, where an old trading post might offer more substantial refuge. As Samuel built a small, nearly smokeless fire to warm them and dry their damp clothing, Maggie found herself studying him with new eyes. The firelight caught the planes of his face, highlighting cheekbones that spoke of ancient lineage and eyes that held both wisdom and sorrow. His hands, moving with practiced efficiency, told the story of a life lived between worlds, calloused from physical labor, yet gentle enough to heal wounds. "Samuel," she said finally, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "If Jenkins believes we died in the flood, could I stay? Not with your people, I know that would bring danger. But somewhere nearby, perhaps." The question hung in the air between them, laden with meaning that transcended the simple words. Samuel added another small branch to the fire before responding. "There are places," he said carefully, "small settlements where questions aren't asked if you work hard and keep to yourself. Places where a woman alone might find peace." He looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "Or where two people from different worlds might build something new." Maggie's heart quickened at the implication. "Two people," she echoed softly. Before Samuel could respond, a sound from the ridge above froze them both, the unmistakable whinny of a horse, followed by a man's low curse. "Get down," Samuel whispered urgently, dousing the fire with a handful of dirt. They pressed themselves against the rock face, barely breathing. From their position, they could see 5 riders picking their way down the treacherous slope into the valley, Jenkins at the lead, his face set in grim determination, even from this distance. "How?" Maggie whispered incredulously. "How did they find us?" Samuel's expression was dark with realization. "They weren't following our trail. They were heading to the trading post by the western pass and saw our cave exit by chance." His voice tightened. "Jenkins recognized the opportunity and is cutting across the valley to intercept where he thinks we'll emerge." Indeed, the riders were angling across the valley floor, moving to establish position at the narrow western end where the valley opened to the lowlands beyond. They would effectively block any escape in that direction. "We're trapped," Maggie breathed, the brief hope of freedom evaporating like morning mist. "The caves are flooded behind us, and Jenkins waits ahead." Samuel's jaw set with determination. "Not trapped. Not yet." He scanned the ridgeline, calculating distances and possibilities. "There's another way, steeper, more dangerous, but they won't expect it." A plan was forming in his mind, one born of desperation and intimate knowledge of the land. But as he turned to explain it to Maggie, he saw her face change, her gaze fixed on something beyond his shoulder. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Look." He turned to see what had captured her attention. On the ridge they had descended only an hour before. A lone figure stood watching them, not one of Jenkins' men, but Kitua, the young Apache warrior who had so vehemently opposed helping Maggie at the camp. His presence could mean only one thing. He had followed them, perhaps from the very beginning. Now, as their eyes met across the distance, Samuel understood that whatever happened next would be determined not just by Jenkins and his hunters, but by this man from his own people who held their fate in his hands. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, Samuel and Kitua stared at each other across the distance. Then, with deliberate slowness, Kitua raised his hand, not in greeting, but to point eastward, toward a narrow ravine barely visible in the ridge face. The message was clear. A path Samuel had forgotten, one known only to their people. "He's helping us," Samuel whispered, surprise evident in his voice. "Why?" Maggie asked, equally stunned. "He wanted me gone." "The ways of my people are not always spoken aloud," Samuel replied, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Kitua opposed you openly so that if trouble came, he could truthfully say he never supported harboring you. But this..." He gestured toward the warrior, who now melted back into the forest cover. "This is the old way. Honor without words." They moved quickly, keeping to the tree line, using the increasing mid-morning mist as cover. Jenkins and his men had dismounted at the western end of the valley, two keeping watch while the others started a fire, settling in for what they clearly expected to be a simple waiting game. The ravine Kitua had indicated was narrow and steep, choked with brush and loose scree that threatened to betray their position with every step. Twice they froze as small cascades of pebbles rolled downward, but the sound of the still swollen creek covered their ascent. "If we can reach the ridge by noon," Samuel whispered, helping Maggie over a particularly challenging section, "we can follow it north to Bear Canyon. There's a settlement there, mostly Mexican farmers, a few white traders, people who mind their own business." "And then?" Maggie asked, not just meaning their immediate plans. Samuel's hand lingered on hers longer than necessary. "Then we decide. Together." The word settled between them like a promise, more binding than any vow spoken in a church. They had nearly reached the top of the ravine when the first shot rang out, the bullet splintering bark inches from Samuel's head. Jenkins stood at the base of the slope, rifle raised for a second shot, his face contorted with rage. "Run!" Samuel pushed Maggie toward the ridgetop as he drew his own weapon. "Don't stop!" She scrambled upward, ignoring the burning pain in her shoulder as the wound reopened. Behind her came another shot, then another. Samuel returned fire once before following her up the steep incline, using the terrain for cover. They crested the ridge as Jenkins and two of his men started up the ravine in pursuit. The others mounted their horses, clearly intending to circle around and cut off escape from the northern end of the ridge. "They're trying to trap us," Maggie gasped, clutching her bleeding shoulder. Samuel nodded grimly, tearing a strip from his shirt to rebind her wound. "We need to reach the canyon before they can position themselves." He looked at her directly. "Can you run?" Maggie straightened, her green eyes flashing with determination. "Watch me." They ran along the ridge crest, lungs burning in the thin mountain air. The terrain was treacherous, loose stones, gnarled roots, unexpected drops, but fear and determination drove them forward. Behind them, Jenkins' periodic shots fell short or wide, but served as constant reminders of the closing distance. Rounding a bend in the ridge path, they encountered an obstacle neither had anticipated. A massive pine had fallen across the trail, its root system torn from the earth by the storm, creating a barrier too high to easily climb and too wide to quickly circumvent. "This way," Samuel directed, leading her to a narrow gap beneath the trunk where erosion had carved a small depression. "You first." Maggie dropped to her stomach and crawled into the space. The wet earth smelled of minerals and decay, and branches scratched at her face as she pulled herself through to the other side. Samuel followed, his broader shoulders barely fitting through the gap. As he emerged, a shot splintered the bark by his head. Jenkins was closer now, his face visible through the trees as he reloaded. "You can't run forever, girl," he shouted, his voice carrying across the distance. "That redskin won't save you. You're marked as mine." Something inside Maggie snapped at those words. Years of running, of hiding, of allowing others to define her existence. It ended here, on this mountain, in this moment. "I am marked," she called back, her voice steady and clear, "but not as yours. Never as yours." She turned to Samuel. "I'm tired of running." Understanding passed between them without words. Together, they positioned themselves behind the fallen tree, which now served as both barrier and cover. Samuel checked his rifle, 3 shots remaining, and his knife. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but perhaps enough for what needed to be done. Jenkins appeared at the bend, rifle raised, his 2 companions flanking him. "There's nowhere left to go," he called, a cruel smile splitting his weathered face. "Come out now, and maybe I'll let your Indian friend live." "You're trespassing on Apache land, Jenkins," Samuel replied calmly. "You and your men should leave while you still can." Jenkins laughed harshly. "Apache land? Boy, this stopped being Indian land when better men than you lost the war. This is American territory now. Is that what they taught you at that school, boy? One of Jenkins' men taunted. To beg like a white man. Samuel's expression remained impassive, but Maggie could feel the tension radiating from him. This wasn't just about their survival now. It was about dignity, about refusing to be defined by others' narrow vision. This land has never belonged to any man, Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of generations. We belong to it. Enough talk, Jenkins snarled, signaling his men to spread out. Shoot the Indian if he moves. The girl is mine. As the men began to advance, a new sound pierced the air. A high, keening whistle, followed by another, then another. The forest seemed to come alive with the calls, echoing from multiple directions at once. Jenkins' men faltered, looking around nervously. Boss, one whispered. That sounds like... It's a trick, Jenkins snapped, but doubt had crept into his voice. From the forest behind them emerged a figure, Kitua, bow drawn and aimed directly at Jenkins. Then another Apache warrior appeared to the right and another to the left. Within moments, 6 warriors stood in a loose semicircle, arrows nocked and ready. Grey Wolf stepped forward, his ancient face solemn with authority. This mountain has witnessed enough blood, he said in clear English. We will not allow more to be spilled today. You're outnumbered, old man, Jenkins blustered, though his rifle barrel had dipped slightly. Grey Wolf smiled thinly. Count again, Foreman. More figures materialized from the trees, not just warriors but women too, including Morningstar and Nijoni. Some held bows, others rifles likely traded for or captured over the years. All stood in silent testimony that this land, whatever the white man's papers might claim, was still defended by its original people. Jenkins' men lowered their weapons, the calculation simple even for them. Only Jenkins himself hesitated, his eyes locked on Maggie with a hatred that transcended reason. She's mine, he insisted, his knuckles white around his rifle. I marked her. No, Jenkins, Maggie replied, stepping forward to stand beside Samuel. You branded me. There's a difference. She drew back the collar of her dress just enough to reveal the healing wound. This mark doesn't define me. It only defines what you are. A man so small, he needs to burn his name into others to feel powerful. Samuel placed a hand on her arm, a gesture of support but also caution. Jenkins was cornered, and cornered men were unpredictable. The woman speaks truth, Morningstar said, her voice carrying the weight of her years. The mark you placed on her flesh is nothing compared to the mark you placed on your own spirit. She gestured toward the trees. Go, return to your world of cutting and taking. Leave this mountain to those who remember how to give back. Jenkins' eyes darted between the Apache surrounding him, calculating odds that grew worse by the moment. Finally, with a curse, he lowered his rifle. This isn't over, he spat. Yes, Grey Wolf contradicted calmly, it is. Under the watchful eyes of the Apache, Jenkins and his men retreated down the ridge path, their former bravado replaced by the sullen silence of the defeated. They would spread tales in the settlements, no doubt, but who would believe stories of Apache ghosts defending haunted mountains? Most would dismiss it as the excuses of men who failed in their task, perhaps aided by too much whiskey. As the danger receded, Maggie turned to Kitua, who stood slightly apart from the others. Why? She asked simply. The young warrior's face remained impassive, but his eyes flickered to Samuel. Not for you, he said in halting English. For him, for what was taken from him. He looked away. And because some marks cannot be seen. Maggie nodded slowly, understanding that beneath his hostility, Kitua too bore invisible scars from the white man's world. Her presence had threatened his people, yes, but perhaps it had also forced him to confront painful truths about the changing world they all inhabited. Grey Wolf approached, his expression grave but not unkind. "You cannot return to the camp," he told them. "The risk remains too great." "I understand," Samuel replied. "We will go north to Bear Canyon." The elder nodded, then surprised them both by placing a hand on Maggie's uninjured shoulder. "You faced your hunter with courage," he acknowledged. "That is the Apache way." The simple acceptance in those words filled Maggie's eyes with tears she refused to let fall. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." As the Apache prepared to return to their hidden camp by secret paths, Morningstar approached with a small leather pouch. "For the journey," she told Maggie, pressing it into her hands. "Medicine for your shoulder and seeds for where you will grow next." Maggie clutched the gift to her chest, overwhelmed by the generosity of these people who had every reason to turn her away. Samuel embraced his Aunt Najoni, the closest thing to family he had left. "I will send word when we are settled," he promised. "Be careful, nephew," she replied, touching his face gently. "The world beyond these mountains does not always see clearly." "I know," he assured her, "but sometimes new eyes can be opened." As the Apache melted back into the forest as silently as they had appeared, Samuel and Maggie found themselves alone on the ridge path. The morning sun had burned away the mist, revealing the vast landscape stretching before them, mountains and valleys, forests and streams, a world of possibility and peril. "Bear Canyon is a 2-day journey," Samuel said, adjusting their meager supplies. "The path won't be easy." Maggie looked at him, this man who had saved her life in more ways than one, who had shown her that dignity could not be branded or beaten away, that belonging was something you carried within rather than a place you found without. "No path worth taking ever is," she replied, taking his hand in hers. Together, they turned northward, two people marked by different worlds, yet finding in each other the strength to forge something new. They would face prejudice, no doubt, hardship certainly, but they would face it standing side by side, neither running nor hiding any longer. As they crested the ridge, Maggie glanced back one last time at the mountains that had nearly claimed her life, and then, unexpectedly, had offered her salvation. The brand on her shoulder would always remain, a permanent reminder of what had been done to her. But now it would also remind her of what she had overcome, of the strength she had found when pushed to her limits, of the unlikely hand that had reached for hers in her darkest moment. Some marks were forced upon you, others you chose for yourself. The difference was everything.